Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. George, your comments about the harbinger of things to come as it relates to the aging population, aging housing stock, and the needs going forward. I think we could have an entire hearing on the importance of aging in America. I think it's by the year 2040 or so, 1 out of 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. We've got real challenges coming in what we need. Would you agree to that?
I agree, Senator. Thank you.
And we have a lot of work to do on that topic. I'd also want to reflect on a little bit the importance of good government policy versus bad government policy. I think Dr. Thomas Sowell said it really well when he said that the goals of rent control and its actual consequences are at opposite policies. I think that's well said, and I oftentimes wonder if all of the great minds can use common sense when it comes to delivering reality. Does reality actually marry the comments? And Dr. Thomas Sowell's comments, I think, are best reflected in the Twin Cities, in St. Paul and Minneapolis. In St. Paul, Minnesota, we saw rent control go in. And when that happened, the census data showed that there was nearly an 80% drop in construction. Next door, Minneapolis did not follow in that suit, and we saw construction permits increase by nearly 70%. Stark example reinforcing the words of one of the greatest economists in my mind of all time. Despite the overwhelming evidence and wide consensus that rent control or rent stabilization depresses supply, exacerbates discrimination, reduces both quality and safety, and makes housing less affordable, amazingly, this administration has chosen to evaluate the feasibility of adopting such policies. Dr. Dietz, how are renters impacted by policies that forbid landlords, including mom and pop landlords, from setting rents at market rates?
Yeah, I think most economists would agree that rent control type policies basically act as a tax on supply in the long run. So they're counterproductive in the sense that the ultimate solution to all the challenges that we're talking about today is adding additional supply. So whether it's rent control or other harmful regulatory policies that show up at the local level, they drive production elsewhere. And what we've seen in the last 10 years is those communities that have been able to add affordable housing stock, whether it's for renters or for home buyers, they attract businesses, they attract jobs. I mean, Columbus, Ohio is a good example of that with the new Intel facility. So it's getting that regulatory burden, whether it's at the federal level or the state and local level, as low as possible so we can add the stock necessary to house that workforce housing.
Do wealthier households or poorer households end up struggling with the consequences of these bad policies, as I would describe them?
Yeah, I would echo some of the data that Dr. Herbert mentioned, which is that if you look at the housing cost burdens, whether for renters or home buyers, they tend to be concentrated among lower income individuals. And as we said earlier, if you talk about the housing that's most difficult to build, it's that smaller lot, slightly more dense, walkable type housing that's appropriate for renters or first-time home buyers. And that's where the regulatory burden emerges the hardest, and it's the kind of housing that's most difficult to build.
The chairman and I both really, when we heard the 1,600 square feet, we both said, wow, and 1,200 is darn near as bad. My mother's first house that I talked about earlier was 1,082 square feet. And so if that's not even possible in some areas, it's just ridiculous. The prices of housing per square foot now has never been higher. If you have to have a minimum square footage to build a house, you're talking to first-time home buyers, and you're just saying, please don't bother thinking about being a part of the American dream. Offensive from my perspective. Dr. Dietz, you also mentioned exclusionary zones. Talk to me for a minute about that.
Yeah, so exclusionary zoning are policies I think economists of the left and the right both agree are inefficient. That's things like minimum lot size requirements. Yep. They basically say, okay, if you want to build that 1,400 square foot house, it's got to be built on a half acre or larger lot. In fact, if you look at the data for New England, the typical lot size of a newly built home is 0.9 acres. It's almost a full acre. Well, you can't build entry-level housing if you've got those kinds of zoning rules. So whether it's zoning rules or federal regulatory policies, what it's done is made it much more difficult for those first-time home buyers to attain home ownership.
I'm running out of time, which is something you'll have to get used to, Mr. Chairman. But I'll just say this, as a guy who used to run a county, chairman of Charleston County government, many of the issues that we're grappling with here in Washington really are local issues. And one of the reasons why I asked you about exclusionary zoning is because it is uniquely and specifically a local issue that many parts of the country face. The truth is, though, that we need to be able to bifurcate our responsibilities versus somebody else's. Perhaps we can send smoke signals, but the truth of the matter is some things need to be challenged on the local level and not here in Washington.